Imagine a country where the women are actually significantly more educated than the men.
Right.
But then you look closer, and barely half of them are even participating in the workforce. And they hold just about 14% of the political power.
Which is incredibly low.
Exactly. Now, imagine that same country has miraculously managed to cut its carbon emissions almost in half.
A huge win on paper.
Yeah, a massive win. But at the exact same time, they are devouring nearly 19 tons of the Earth's physical resources per citizen every single year.
It's just a wild
It
contradiction.
really is.
Yeah.
You might look at those contrasting facts and think, we have to be talking about two entirely different nations.
Right. It doesn't seem like it could be the same place.
But in the United Nations data we're looking at today, this is just one place. This is Hungary.
It's a statistical profile that completely disrupts our standard, comfortable definitions of success,
Yeah, we love to put countries into neat little boxes.
Exactly. Easily digestible categories like developed versus developing or, rich versus poor, sustainable versus polluting.
But the data refuses to cooperate with that.
It really does. It refuses to be binary. It forces us to look past those top-line numbers and really examine the deep structural realities of a society.
And that is exactly our mission for today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a fascinating data set.
Yeah, we are not just giving you a standard news update today or like skimming a Wikipedia page.
Mm-hmm.
We are launching into a massive data-driven mystery.
We really have a towering, customized stack of UN human development data sitting right in front of us.
We literally have a 15-page presentation outline covering over 3 decades, right? From 1990 all the way to 2023.
That's right, a full 33-year longitudinal view.
And our subject, as we mentioned, is Hungary. On paper, this is a highly developed European nation.
If you just glance at the top-line report card, they look like an absolute A-plus student.
But as we dig into these indices today, we're going to uncover the hidden glass ceilings, the economic bottlenecks, and, well, the structural paradoxes of a modern economy.
We're going to explore what happens when a society successfully climbs to the very top of the developmental mountain, only to realize the summit is just full of structural cracks.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because looking at this spreadsheet, the sheer volume of numbers is intimidating. Where do we even begin to find the narrative in 33 years of macroeconomic data?
We begin by grounding ourselves in what this data actually represents because, data is never just numbers in a cell.
Right, it's actual people.
Exactly. It's a story about human lives. It's a mathematical reflection of power dynamics, resource allocation, and, as we'll see later, our relationship with the environment.
So when we look at this UN data, specifically the Human Development Index, the HDI, what are we really looking at?
Well, we have to remember the historical context of why this metric even exists in the first place. For the longest time, the global community really just asked one question to determine a country's success.
Which was basically, how much money does this country make?
Right. We relied almost entirely on gross domestic product, or GDP.
The classic ledger of capitalism, just counting the cash in the National Register.
Precisely. But the UN recognized that a massive GDP doesn't necessarily mean the actual people are living well.
Because you can have a country exporting billions in oil, for instance, while half the population lacks basic sanitation.
That's exactly it. So the HDI was created as a counter-narrative. It stepped in and asked a fundamentally better question, which is, what is the actual quality of life for the people living in that country?
And how do they measure that quality of life structurally?
The HDI measures 3 foundational dimensions. It looks at a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
So it's basically the difference between asking how big and expensive a house is versus opening the front door and asking if the people living inside it are actually educated, healthy, and thriving.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it, yeah. And when we apply that specific lens to Hungary's trajectory from 1990 to 2023, the data tells a story of absolute triumph.
I have the chart right here. In 1990, their HDI score was 0.733. Fast forward to 2023, and that score has climbed to a staggering 0.870.
And we should contrast that with the global average, right? Over that same period, the global average went from 0.60 up to 0.756.
So Hungary isn't just growing, they are maintaining a massive lead. They are 0.114 points ahead of the global average.
It's a remarkable ascent.
Just to give you listening some context on those numbers, an HDI of 0.870 places Hungary at a global rank of 47 out of over 200 countries and territories measured by the UN.
which means they are firmly entrenched in what the UN officially calls the very high human development category.
Okay, so they're in the elite club. What is driving that specific number up so high?
It is driven by two primary engines, wealth and health.
Let's examine the wealth component first. The UN measures this through gross national income, right? GNI per capita.
Yes, but crucially, this metric is adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Hold on. Before we throw out the numbers, let's clarify that mechanism for the listener. Why use purchasing power parity instead of just, converting everything to US dollars and comparing the bank accounts directly?
Because a flat currency conversion doesn't tell you how people actually live day to day.
Make that real for me.
Sure, if I hand you $100 in New York City, you might be able to buy a decent dinner for two, maybe.
If you're lucky, yeah.
But if I hand you the equivalent of $100 in Budapest, you could probably buy groceries for an entire week.
Ah, okay.
So purchasing power parity adjusts the income data to account for the actual local cost of living. It measures what your money can actually buy in your specific economy.
I see. It levels the playing field, so we are comparing actual living standards, not just arbitrary currency exchange rates.
Precisely. And using that adjusted metric, Hungary's GNI per capita in 1990 was roughly $21,433. By 2023, that number had skyrocketed to $37,236.
Wow. Wait, what's the global average for GNI right now?
The global average in 2023 is just over $20,300.
So they are nearly double the global average in terms of local purchasing power. The average economic output per person just exploded in that time frame.
It really did. And then you pair that economic explosion with the public health data.
I was just looking at this. The life expectancy at birth in Hungary in 1990 was 69.3 years.
And by 2023?
By 2023, it jumped to over 77 years. Specifically, 77.02 years.
Which is nearly 4 years longer than the current global average of 73.3. What's fascinating here is the sheer logistical difficulty of moving that specific needle.
What do you mean by that?
Adding nearly 8 years to the average life expectancy of an entire national population in just over 3 decades is, well, it's a monumental achievement.
Because it's an average of millions of people.
Exactly. Think about the underlying mechanics required to make that a reality. It is not just about having a few world-class surgeons in the capital city.
Right, you need everyone to live longer.
It requires a systematic, nationwide overhaul of public health infrastructure. It means dramatically lowering infant mortality rates across rural and urban areas alike.
It means better sanitation, safer workplace regulations.
Yes, ensuring widespread access to life-saving pharmaceuticals and figuring out how to manage chronic, age-related diseases like hypertension and diabetes effectively across millions of citizens.
I have to push back a little here, though.
Okay, go ahead.
I look at that 1990 to 2023 timeline, and I think about the global explosion of technology, the invention of new drugs, the internet. Isn't this just the natural progression of time?
You mean, didn't basically every country see their life expectancy go up?
Yeah, over the last 30 years, just by existing in the modern era, you get better medicine.
It is true that global baselines have improved overall, but you have to look at Hungary's specific historical context in 1990. They weren't just riding a wave of global technological progress.
They were dealing with the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. They were navigating the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. They were undergoing an unprecedented and, frankly, often chaotic transition from a state-planned socialist economy to a free market capitalist system.
That's a massive structural shock.
Historically, when nations undergo macroeconomic shocks of that magnitude, when state industries just collapse overnight, unemployment suddenly spikes, and the social safety net is fundamentally rewritten, public health usually plummets.
Oh, wow. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, we saw life expectancies actually drop significantly in several post-Soviet states during the 1990s due to the immense societal stress, poverty, and institutional collapse.
So the fact that Hungary didn't just survive that transition, but actively added almost 8 years to their lifespan and nearly doubled their wealth, proves that this wasn't accidental.
It required deliberate, effective statecraft. They had to actually build the new roads, train the new nurses, and stabilize the institutions while the ground was literally shifting underneath them.
Okay, I am looking at this data, and it is undeniably impressive. But I have to voice the skepticism that I'm sure you, listening right now, might be feeling.
Let's hear it.
If we have a country that has doubled its wealth, stabilized its institutions, and added nearly a decade to its citizens' lives, why are we analyzing them today?
It's a fair question.
If everything is so fantastic, What is the hidden paradox we promised at the start of the show? It's like looking at a perfectly frosted cake, but you're telling me the sponge inside is somehow dry.
I love that analogy, and yes, that is exactly what the data suggests. The paradox emerges because the HDI, for all its brilliance, is fundamentally an average.
And averages can hide a lot of sins.
Averages are notoriously exceptional at hiding extremes. Imagine you have a room of 10 people. 9 of those people have absolutely $0 in their bank accounts. One person has $10 million.
Okay.
On average, every single person in that room is a millionaire.
Right, mathematically that's true.
But the lived reality of that room is one of extreme, grinding poverty existing directly alongside extreme hoarded wealth. That is the critical limitation of the standard HDI.
It tells us the total size of the national pie, but it tells us absolutely nothing about how that pie is actually sliced and distributed.
Exactly. So to look past the average, we turn to a diagnostic tool the UN introduced called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
The IHDI. I want to understand the actual mechanics of this. How does the UN mathematicalize inequality?
The IHDI takes that beautiful, perfectly frosted HDI score of 0.870, and it applies a mathematical discount rate based on how unequally the achievements in health, education, and income are distributed across the population.
Wait, let me make sure I have this right. So if a country had absolute utopian equality, meaning every single citizen had the exact same income, the exact same years of education, and lived to the exact same age, the HDI and the IHDI would be identical.
Spot on. They would be exactly the same. But the more disparity that exists within the society, the further the IHDI falls below the standard HDI.
It's like measuring a city's internet speed.
Oh, I like where this is going.
The average might look like a lightning-fast gigabit connection because you have a few massive hyper-connected tech campuses driving the numbers up.
Right.
But if half the residential neighborhoods are still struggling on dial-up connections, that average doesn't reflect the daily reality of the citizens. The IHDI is the metric that checks the dial-up neighborhoods.
That is a perfect mechanical analogy. It measures the loss and potential human development due to structural disparities. So let's apply this internet speed test, so to speak, to Hungary.
Okay, looking at the UN waterfall chart here. When we factor in inequality, Hungary's HDI score drops from 0.870 down to an IHDI of 0.819.
Which is a measurable hit. It represents an overall loss of roughly 5.86% of their human development.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure.
If we look at the UN's global data sets, the average global loss due to inequality hovers somewhere around 21.96%, right?
That's correct, nearly 22% globally.
And some developing nations lose over 30% of their development to inequality. So a 5.86% drop for Hungary actually seems, well, incredibly good. Why is this a red flag?
You are absolutely right that in a global context, a nearly 6% loss means Hungary is fundamentally a much more egalitarian society than the vast majority of the world.
They rank 34th globally on the IHDI, which is pretty solid.
It is excellent. However, when you are an A-plus student, you don't compare yourself to the failing grades. You look at where you are still losing points. And when we break down exactly where that 5.86% loss is coming from, it reveals a massive structural bottleneck.
Let's break those coefficients down. Because the UN data separates the inequality into 3 distinct buckets, right? Education, life expectancy, and income.
Yes. And this is where the diagnostic water gets incredibly revealing. The data shows that the Hungarian state is actually operating a remarkably equitable system for public goods.
Let's look at the numbers. Their inequality in education coefficient is incredibly low, sitting at just 2.547%.
Which means that the quality of classrooms, the funding of schools, and the years spent in the education system are very evenly distributed.
Regardless of whether you were born to a wealthy family in Budapest or a working-class family in a rural town.
Precisely. The state is doing its job there. And we see a mirrored success story in their health data.
Right. The inequality in life expectancy coefficient is also exceptionally well managed at 3.724%.
Basic medical care, preventative medicine, and hospital access are broadly available enough that health outcomes aren't wildly diverging between different demographic or geographic groups.
But then we hit the third bucket, income.
Yes, the structural roadblock. While education and health inequalities are managed down in that 2 to 3% range, inequality in income sits at a massive 11.336%.
So what does this all mean? It means the development tax isn't coming from the schools, and it isn't coming from the hospitals. It is coming entirely from the bank accounts.
The state apparatus is highly efficient at providing knowledge and longevity to the masses. but the actual financial wealth being generated by this modern, thriving economy.
That $37,000 GNI we talked about earlier.
Exactly. That wealth is bottlenecking. It is pooling disproportionately at the very top of the economic ladder. The economic gains of the nation are simply not reaching the average citizen proportionally.
Look at your own office or your own industry. Think about how often you see average company revenue mask the fact that only the executive suite saw any meaningful financial growth.
It's a very common phenomenon.
You can have a company post record-breaking billion-dollar profits, but if the people on the factory floor or the mid-level managers haven't seen a raise that matches inflation in 5 years, that average success feels entirely fictitious to them.
And that is exactly what this 11.3% income inequality coefficient represents, just scaled up to an entire national economy.
And it creates a profound societal friction, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, because from the perspective of the median citizen, they have upheld their end of the social contract.
Right. They went to the schools the state provided. They participated in the health initiatives.
They are highly capable, long-living, educated workers participating in a booming macroeconomic system, yet the financial rewards of their labor seem arbitrarily gated.
The engine of the economy is running beautifully, but the transmission is slipping. The power simply isn't making it to the wheels.
That's exactly it.
So we've established that the wealth is bottlenecking at the top. But this raises a darker question about access. If the wealth is gated, who exactly is being kept out?
We need to understand who is structurally blocked from that income.
And when we transition from the macroeconomic spreadsheets to the demographic data, specifically regarding the men and women making up this economy, we hit a paradox that genuinely left me speechless when I first read our sources.
It is arguably one of the most profound contradictions in the entire UN dataset. To analyze the gender dynamics, the UN utilizes two separate indices to paint a comprehensive picture.
Let's start with the first one, the Gender Development Index, or the GDI.
Right. The GDI measures the foundational gender gaps in human development by looking at the exact same three dimensions as the standard HDI health, knowledge, and living standards.
So it is essentially a ratio of female HDI to male HDI.
Yes. And Hungary's performance here is spectacular. Their GBI score is 0.989.
Astonishingly high. To give that number context for the listener, a score of 1.0 would represent absolute flawless mathematical parity between men and women in these foundational metrics.
So sitting at 0.989 places Hungary at a global rank of 59, putting them squarely in the top tier of nations for basic gender parity.
And this is where the data tells a truly incredible story of educational victory. I'm looking at page 6 of our outline. Let's look at the expected years of schooling for 2023.
The numbers are fascinating.
For males in Hungary, the expectation is 15.12 years of education. But for females, it is actually significantly higher, sitting at 15.84 years.
Women in this country are receiving, on average, more education than the men.
And when you look at basic secondary education, it is near universal across the board. Over 98% for women and 99% for men.
The human capital pipeline is primed to absolute perfection. The state has invested heavily in the intellectual development of its female population.
If you are an alien coming down to Earth and you only looked at this specific UN dataset, you would assume that the Hungarian economy, its corporate boardrooms, and its political landscape must be utterly dominated by this massive cohort of highly educated, highly capable women.
You would certainly think so.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you turn the page on the UN report, you move from the foundational metrics to the integration metrics, and you see a stunning, almost unbelievable reversal.
You are referring to the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
Yes, and specifically the labor force participation rates on page 7 of our data. Despite having significantly more expected years of schooling, the female labor force participation rate in Hungary is only 54.47%.
Meanwhile, the male labor force participation rate is 68.35%.
That is a nearly 14-point gap in labor participation.
It is a massive structural inefficiency.
I am genuinely struggling to wrap my head around the logic of this. It's like a nation spending millions of dollars in 15 years training a marathon runner.
Okay, I see the analogy.
You buy them the best shoes, you give them the best diet, you coach them to peak physical perfection, and they are objectively faster than the competition. And then, on the day of the actual race, you lock the gate to the track so they can't even line up at the starting line.
It is a massive, incomprehensible loss of national return on investment.
Why do this? Why educate them and then not use that talent?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the sociological concept of the leaky pipeline in human capital.
The leaky pipeline.
Yes, providing equal or even superior education to women is only step one of a truly developed society. But an education system does not exist in a vacuum.
Right, eventually you
No.
graduate.
Eventually, it has to interact with the structural realities of the labor market and deep-seated cultural norms. If the labor market is inflexible, or if cultural barriers remain solidly in place, you end up exactly here. Highly educated citizens entirely sidelined from the economic engine.
But let me challenge that interpretation,
Yeah.
because I know some people might look at this and say, well, maybe it's not a structural barrier.
What's the alternative theory?
Could someone look at this data and argue that it's just a cultural preference? Maybe Hungarian families just prefer traditional household structures, and women are voluntarily choosing to stay home.
It's a common counter-argument, definitely. But the educational data itself deeply undermines that theory.
How so?
People who intend to opt out of the modern economy entirely do not generally spend nearly 16 years pursuing advanced education.
That makes sense.
You not see a massive societal push for female university enrollment if the universal goal is purely domesticity. The desire and the preparation to participate are clearly there, documented by the GDI. The drop-off happens specifically at the point of labor market entry and retention.
So what are the specific mechanics of this drop-off? What forces are benching these women?
The primary mechanism globally, and specifically in highly developed European nations like Hungary, is the burden of uncompensated caregiving. We often refer to this as the second shift.
The second shift.
The expectation, both culturally and structurally, overwhelmingly falls on women to manage childcare, elder care, and the logistics of household management.
And that takes time. A lot of time.
Exactly. If a society does not provide robust, affordable, and universally accessible childcare infrastructure, a friction point is created.
And furthermore, if corporate cultures demand inflexible 60-hour work weeks or penalize workers for taking time off for family emergencies, those jobs become fundamentally incompatible with family management.
And when a family is forced to make a choice between managing the home and participating in an inflexible labor market, the structural pressure forces the woman to step back, regardless of her 16 years of education.
Because someone has to pick up the kids.
Exactly. And the UN data shows that this isn't just an economic sidelining, it translates directly into a political sidelining.
This is page 8 of our outline. The political glass ceiling.
Yes. The GII also measures political empowerment by tracking the percentage of parliamentary seats held by women. In 2023, despite this massive educational advantage, women held only 14.07% of the seats in the Hungarian parliament.
14.07%. That is shockingly low.
To fully contextualize how low that is, let's look at the global baseline. The global average for female parliamentary representation is 26.54%.
Let that sink in. Hungary, this highly developed A-plus student of a nation, with a female population that is more educated than its male population, has a female political representation rate that is barely more than half of the global average.
That is the glass ceiling made mathematically visible.
You have women who have spent more time in the classroom, who are statistically more prepared, yet they are nearly absent from the halls of power, where the laws governing their very society are written.
And this creates a devastating self-perpetuating feedback loop. Think about the mechanics of policy creation.
Okay, let's walk through it.
If the people making the laws, writing the budgets, and shaping the economic structures are predominantly men who statistically do not bear the primary burden of uncompensated care work, they are far less likely to prioritize the structural reforms needed to fix the labor market inflexibility.
Right, because it's not their primary pain point.
Exactly. The subsidized childcare policies, the equitable parental leave structures, the protections for flexible working hours, these issues remain consistently unaddressed.
Which ensures that the female labor force participation rate stays artificially depressed. It is a profound structural failure.
And just to add another layer from page 9 of our data, it's not that the state doesn't care about women's well-being.
Right, the health indicators in the GII are fantastic.
They really are. The maternal mortality ratio is down to 15.05 per 100,000 live births. The global average is over 216.
And the adolescent birth rate is 17.54 per 1,000, compared to a global average of 39. So the healthcare system is highly protective and effective for women.
But protection is not the same as empowerment. Health scores are high, but the severe lack of political empowerment drags their entire GII ranking down to 55th globally.
Have you ever been in a situation where you were undeniably the most qualified person for an opportunity? You had the best degree, the most relevant experience, the highest test scores, but you were kept out by invisible structural rules.
I think many people can relate to that.
Maybe the crucial networking happened at a private golf course you didn't have access to, or the mandatory meetings were always scheduled exactly when you had to pick your kids up from school. That feeling of deep individual frustration is happening here on a macroeconomic scale.
Mm.
The human potential is documented, it is certified by the state, but it's being left on the table.
It absolutely forces us to redefine what development actually means. A high gender development index simply means you have built a fantastic launch pad.
But a poor gender inequality index driven by massive labor and political gaps means you have effectively grounded the rocket before it could even take off.
It is an incomplete, fractured definition of development. It is a society optimizing for potential, but completely failing at integration.
So if we synthesize what we found so far, this economy is incredibly efficient at creating wealth, but it hoards that wealth at the top. And the pathways to accessing that hoarded wealth are structurally gated, actively benching the highly educated female population.
That's a solid summary of the internal dynamics.
But this raises an even darker question, because generating $37,000 per capita doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires immense physical energy, raw materials, and industrial output.
It requires Earth.
Right. What is the actual physical toll this A-plus economy is taking on the Earth to maintain this veneer of prosperity?
This brings us to perhaps the most crucial addition to the UN's analytical toolkit in recent years. Because historically, human development has been inextricably linked to environmental destruction.
The richer a country got, the more fossil fuels they burned and the more forests they cleared.
Exactly. To measure this, the UN introduced the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Page 10 of our outline. What are the actual mechanics of the PHDI? How do you mathematically adjust human development for environmental damage?
The PHDI takes a standard HDI score and applies a discount based on the level of pressure the country is exerting on the planet.
And it looks specifically at two distinct metrics, right?
Yes, carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita. If a country is achieving high wealth and long lifespans, but is doing so by heavily polluting the atmosphere and rapidly extracting finite resources, their human development score takes a massive penalty.
Let's apply this planetary pressure test to our subject. Hungary's standard HDI is 0.870. When we factor in their environmental impact, what happens to that score?
The score drops significantly. It falls from 0.870 down to 0.757.
That is a steep 12.99% penalty applied to their human development score, entirely due to environmental impact.
And that's compared to a global average penalty of about 10.05%. So their environmental cost is higher than average.
Nearly 13% of their development is essentially a mirage. It's borrowed from the planet.
It is exactly that. It's an ecological debt. But here is the fascinating twist when you look at this data in a global context. Despite taking this massive, nearly 13% hit, when you look at the PHDI rankings, Hungary actually jumps up 19 places globally.
Wait. I need to make sure I understand this. In the standard HDI, they rank 47th.
Yes.
But when you adjust for planetary pressure, they rank 23rd. They lose 13% of their total score, but they move UP 19 places in the global ranking. How does that math possibly work?
It works because other highly developed nations are doing much, much worse.
Oh, wow.
The stark reality of global development is that the countries at the very top of the traditional HDI rankings, the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nations on Earth, are almost universally the biggest drivers of planetary destruction.
So when the UN applies the environmental discount globally, the biggest economies on Earth just tumble down the rankings.
Exactly. Hungary, while still extracting a heavy toll, is doing so significantly less destructively than many of its peers in the very high human development bracket.
When you look at the UN's own wording and the sheer scale of those global rank drops, I mean, the data acts as a staggering indictment of the global north.
It truly does.
The numbers suggest that what we have historically called success relies heavily on a system of ecological borrowing that is fundamentally unsustainable.
It does, but we have to look closer at Hungary's specific environmental data because it contains a wild contradiction of its own. It is a tale of two entirely different metrics.
Carbon emissions versus material footprint. Let's start with the carbon data on page 11, because there is actually a major triumph buried in here, right?
Yes, their decarbonization data is highly impressive. In 1990, Hungary's carbon dioxide emissions per capita from production were 7.077 tons.
Okay, and today?
Fast forward to 2023, and that number has plummeted to 3.957 tons.
Wow. And the global average is around 4.5 tons, right? So they're actually below the global average now.
Yes, they have nearly cut their per capita carbon emissions in half while simultaneously doubling their GNI. This is exactly what environmental economists call decoupling, breaking the historical, seemingly inevitable link between economic growth and carbon pollution.
Well, wait, isn't that just the inevitable cost of modernizing a post-Soviet state?
How do you mean?
Well, you can't ask a country transitioning out of the Eastern Bloc in 1990 to instantly become a green utopia. They had to build roads, they had to build hospitals, they had to establish new industries. Isn't a certain level of emissions just the necessary price of the 8-year life expectancy jump we celebrated earlier?
That is the exact debate at the heart of developmental economics. Yes, initial infrastructure development requires carbon. But Hungary's success in cutting emissions while growing wealthier proves that continuous carbon pollution is not a prerequisite for sustained wealth.
So it proves it can be done.
Their drop in emissions speaks to a cleaner energy grid, better industrial regulations, and a deliberate shift away from the heaviest, dirtiest forms of manufacturing that characterized the Soviet era.
So they are getting richer while putting significantly less carbon into the atmosphere. That sounds like exactly what the world needs to do to solve climate change.
It is a vital step. However, the carbon metric only tells half the environmental story.
Right.
The other half is the material footprint on page 12 of our outline. And this is where the mechanics of a modern economy reveal their hidden debt.
Explain the mechanism of the material footprint to me, because clearly this is the catch.
The material footprint measures the total physical amount of raw materials extracted from the earth to meet a nation's final consumption demands.
So we are talking about physical weight.
Yes, the physical weight of biomass, metal ores, non-metallic minerals, and fossil fuels. It is the sheer volume of stuff a society consumes.
Okay, let's hear the numbers.
In 1990, Hungary's material footprint per capita was 15.48 tons. By 2023, despite cutting their carbon emissions in half, their material footprint steadily climbed to a massive 18.8 tons per person.
18.8 tons.
Wow.
And the global average is what, 12.7 tons?
Exactly, so they are way above the global average.
So they are emitting less gas into the air, but they are physically devouring more of the earth.
That is exactly what the data shows.
It's like a person trying to get healthy who switches to drinking diet soda, but simultaneously starts ordering 3 extra burgers for every meal.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
You fix one specific dial, the sugar, or in this case, the carbon, but your total overall consumption is still completely out of control.
This raises an important question regarding what true sustainability actually looks like. How can a country lower its carbon but increase its material footprint?
How does that happen?
The mechanism is essentially outsourcing. The profound difference between these two metrics exposes the reality of modern consumer economies. Hungary's domestic energy grid might be getting greener. They might be driving more electric cars or powering their homes with solar panels.
But the economy has fundamentally shifted into hyperconsumerism.
Yes, and they are importing the physical costs of that lifestyle.
So even if the local Hungarian factory is powered by wind turbines, the Hungarian consumer is still buying millions of fast fashion garments, disposable electronics, and single-use packaging that had to be physically extracted from the earth.
Precisely. That 18.8 tons of material footprint means more mining for lithium and copper to build smartphones. It means more logging for the cardboard packaging required by e-commerce. It means massive sand extraction to produce concrete for urban expansion.
It is the physical weight of a high-consumption, disposable lifestyle.
And crucially, the UN material footprint is a consumption-based metric. This means it includes the ecological cost of goods imported from other countries.
Oh, that is a massive distinction.
It changes everything, doesn't it?
It really does. So if a consumer in Budapest buys a new smartphone that was manufactured in Asia, the material cost of mining the rare earth metals in Africa, shipping them to Asia, assembling the phone, and shipping it to Europe, all of that physical extraction is attributed to Hungary's footprint, not the manufacturing country's footprint.
Exactly. The UN designed this metric specifically to prevent wealthy countries from offshoring their environmental impact.
Because otherwise you could just close your dirty domestic factories, transition to a pristine service economy, import all your heavy physical goods from abroad, and claim you are a green nation.
But the material footprint holds the end consumer mathematically responsible. And what this data shows is that while Hungary has successfully cleaned up its domestic energy production, its appetite for physical resources is ravenous and actively growing.
Look around the room you are in right now. The energy powering the lights above you might be getting greener. Your local utility company might be proudly transitioning to wind and solar, but look at the sheer volume of physical stuff occupying your space.
The multiple glowing screens, the synthetic fibers in your furniture.
The endless stream of delivery boxes piling up in the recycling bin. Every single physical item represents extraction. It represents a hidden, massive debt to the planet.
Decarbonizing the grid is absolutely essential. But if we just use clean energy to accelerate our extraction of physical resources, we haven't solved the crisis, we've just changed the flavor of the destruction.
It really highlights the dual nature of the planetary boundary crisis. We have a climate crisis driven by carbon emissions, but we also have an ecological overshoot crisis driven by sheer material consumption.
And Hungary's data beautifully and terrifyingly illustrates how a country can actively solve the former while simultaneously worsening the latter.
So what's the solution on the final pages of our data? True, long-term sustainability requires not just a transition in energy sources, right?
Right. Our strategy outline suggests a fundamental transition to a circular economy where material extraction is strictly capped and resources are endlessly cycled rather than consumed and discarded.
Okay, let's bring all these sprawling threads together because this has been an incredibly dense, fascinating journey through the data.
You've covered a lot of ground.
We started this deep dive looking at an A-plus student. We looked at Hungary, a country that over 33 years managed to beat the historical hurdles of the post-Soviet transition.
They doubled their national wealth. They added 8 years to their life expectancy.
If you just look at the surface of the water, it looks incredibly calm, prosperous, and successful.
But as we utilize the UN's deeper diagnostic tools, the currents told a far more complex narrative.
We found a nation grappling with hoarded wealth, where an 11.3% income inequality metric acts as a structural bottleneck.
Quietly draining the potential of that high average income and keeping the middle class separated from the macroeconomic gains.
And we found the gender paradox, a society that successfully and equitably educates its women to a higher degree than its men, only to functionally bench them from the workforce due to the inflexible mechanisms of uncompensated care.
They've built a highly capable demographic, yet lock them out of the parliament, leaving vast reserves of brilliance and perspective structurally sidelined.
And finally, we uncovered the planetary contradiction. A nation that should rightfully be applauded for decoupling its economic growth from carbon emissions, yet remains deeply trapped in an accelerating cycle of material hyperconsumerism.
Devouring nearly 19 tons of the Earth per citizen every single year through outsourced extraction.
The data tells a story of a modern economy that is undeniably highly developed, yet fundamentally structurally fractured. And it leaves me with one final provocative thought, something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
I think I know where you're going with this.
If the ultimate goal of a society for the last century has been to climb this Human Development Index, to get rich, to get healthy, and to get educated, and we are seeing, clearly documented in the UN data, that reaching the very top of that mountain still leaves a society riddled with invisible glass ceilings, hoarded wealth, and massive environmental debts. Is the index itself flawed?
It is the ultimate philosophical question this data provokes.
Are we optimizing our lives and our societies for the wrong definition of success?
If winning the economic game still breaks the planet and leaves half the population structurally sidelined from power, maybe it's time to change the rules of the game entirely.
It's a profound question that requires us all to look closer at the metrics we use to measure our own progress. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers.
It's been a pleasure to unpack this with you.
We encourage you to take this analytical lens and look at the dashboards of your own lives, your own workplaces, and your own countries with a more critical eye. Look past the perfectly frosted cake and ask what's really inside the sponge. Until next time.